Hello everyone, welcome to our 10th meeting of the 44th season. Great to see such a big crowd again. It's been great to see the increase in membership and enthusiasm this season. And we've had as many as 350 people attending these meetings on cold and wet nights in the northwest of England. And it won't be happening anywhere else, I can assure you of that. So congratulations to all of you. Tonight we're talking about Japan, a dramatic change from last week's talk about Russia, and hopefully this will be a more uplifting experience. Did I say something amusing? Yes, let's hope so, because we're delighted to welcome Paul Madden, and you've seen his CV, illustrious CV, which led him to be the ambassador in Singapore, Australia, and Japan, most recently until 2021. So he comes back relatively fresh with ideas about modern Japan, some of which was expressed in this book that I wrote to you about called Thank You, Japan, and I won't steal his thunder, except to say it's a really, you saw the reviews of it, and he's kindly brought, it's published over there, it's not on sale here. That's why he kindly has dragged 30 copies, of which I'm buying one, so there are 29 available to members who would like to have one. Thank You, Japan, Twittering Thanks to Japan by the Koso Press. So that's just one dimension, and so Paul brings not only the geopolitical ideas that are implicit in the title of his talk, but he's also extremely knowledgeable and immersed in the culture of Japan, and I hope that will be reflected in his talk tonight. So please welcome Paul Madden.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here at Keele World Affairs, which has such a strong reputation as a public forum. Thank you all for coming on this warm, sunny evening when you could have been sat at home in the garden. And it's very good to see so many of you here. It's quite a contrast to a talk that I was giving in the West Country at a drafty church hall a few years ago, when the audience consisted of not much more than 2 men and a dog. And the chairman began his introduction of me by haranguing the audience. And he said, look, if more of you don't start coming to these meetings, we'll never get a decent speaker. Well, thank you very much, I thought. So as ambassador in Japan, I had quite a few interesting experiences, but none were quite as interesting as that which was had by one of my predecessors who had been ambassador there in the 1970s. And he was on a regional visit, and he went to a provincial town in the north of Japan, got off the train at the station and found that the mayor, the town council were there to meet him, the town brass band was there, and there was a big banner stretched across the front of the station saying, "A hearty welcome to the ambassador of France." And now he was a very nice man, like all British ambassadors, and he didn't want anyone to feel bad about it, so he decided that he would just pretend to be the French ambassador. And he spent the rest of the day talking in a sort of pseudo-French accent. But he had a bit of a mischievous sense of fun, and so he couldn't resist from time to time saying things like, "Well, you know, even though I am the French ambassador, I have to tell you, the best country in the world, in my opinion, is the Grande-Bretagne." The nearest experience I had like that with a misunderstanding was about this time of year. I was invited to speak at the annual Christmas dinner of the Christians in the Japanese parliament. And it's mainly a Shinto and a Buddhist country, so there are not many Christians in the Japanese parliament. So they invited a bunch of ambassadors along to make up the numbers. And we were all invited to say a few words, and so I made a little speech in Japanese. And one of the other ambassadors from one of the African countries was speaking in English, but had quite a heavy accent. So when she wanted to say miracles, she pronounced it miracles, and the interpreter heard it as Americans, which led to these wonderful misinterpretations where she was alleged to have said, You know, Jesus Christ came on this earth to create Americans. And when things go really bad in the world, we just go down on our knees and pray for an American. Well, given what's happening in America, amen to that, I say. So I spent most of my diplomatic career living in Asia-Pacific. I was there for over 20 years, and as you heard, I was ambassador in Japan, Australia, and Singapore. And I consider myself privileged to have been representing Britain in such an interesting part of the world. It's a really fast-changing region. It's a region with lots of economic opportunities, and it's also a region that is not without a number of security challenges. And I'm going to be talking about some of that today. So I'm going to be talking particularly about Japan in the Indo-Pacific, and particularly some of the strategic issues and the challenges that it faces. But first of all, just a brief introduction to the country. I'm sure some of you will be familiar, but people aren't always that familiar with Japan. So first of all, starting with its location. And I did geography at university, so I always love to start with maps. You can see it's an island archipelago, 4 main islands off the east coast of the Asian landmass. And so most of its historic cultural influences have come from that Asian landmass, and particularly from China. But it's also had a relatively independent development, not least because it had a closed period from 1633 to 1853, when they didn't allow any foreigners into the country, until it was forced to reopen by the Western powers in the middle of the 19th century. It's got a population of 123 million people, which makes it the 12th most populous country in the world, so it's quite a significant size. Its economy is about $4.2 trillion, and it was actually displaced by Germany last year as the world's 3rd largest economy after America and China. And that was quite a historic development because Japan had supplanted Germany as long ago as 1968. And one of the main reasons why Germany actually took back that mantle was because the yen is very low at the moment, and so when you calculate the GDP in dollar terms, it works out lower. But let me give you a quick bit of background to Japan's economic trajectory. It went through a famous period of high growth from the 1950s all the way through to the 1980s, and that culminated in the so-called bubble economy period in the late 80s and the early 90s, when there was a huge asset price bubble which developed in the stock market and the real estate sector. Japanese companies, Japanese consumers went on a global spending spree. And I think you can probably remember that almost everywhere you went in the world, everywhere you went in the UK at that time, there were Japanese tourists, usually led by a lady with a flag. I was living there at that time, and it was a really exhilarating period to be based in Japan. And Japan was a huge focus of international attention then, a bit like China has become more recently. And then that bubble burst, and Japan entered a couple of what they called the lost decades of economic stagnation. There were lots of industrial consolidation, banks and companies went bust and were taken over and so on. And then finally, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, seen here, who was Prime Minister, first of all, from 2006 to 7, and then again from 2012 to 2020, he restored economic confidence with his famous Abenomics program. And that consisted of fiscal and monetary stimuluses, and also some, but not quite enough, structural reforms. Nowadays, in more recent times, the economy has been recovering fairly slowly after COVID. It grew at just under 2% last year, probably be just under 1% this year. And Japan faces a big demographic issue, which you may have heard about. Its population is actually falling by 1 million every year. And the reason for that is because the birth rate has dramatically reduced. The older people are living for very long periods of time. It's one of the oldest lived or longest lived societies in the world. But this lack of young people coming through is quite a challenge because there are not going to be enough young people to work in the care sector and the health sector or pay the taxes to support this increasingly elderly population. And yet, Japan has rather set its face against large-scale immigration. In fact, only 2% of the people who live in Japan are not ethnically Japanese, so it's very different from most advanced economies in that sense. And part of the reason is that they are worried that immigration would change their very homogeneous society with its famous social cohesion. Japan is an incredibly safe society. I don't know if many of you have had the chance to go there, but you see very few crimes, you see no violence on the streets. People are very conformist compared to the rather independent-minded people that we have in Britain. And this has some advantages. But of course, there are some disadvantages too, if you happen to be different in some way, for example. Japan is gradually becoming more tolerant, but it's in a very different place to us in the UK and in the West on many of those identity issues which have such a high profile in recent times. And the role of women in senior positions, whether it's in politics or government or business, is still very much below that which you find in most other rich countries. So the populist movements, which we've seen in America and in Europe in recent times, from the diatribes on social media through to riots on the streets, are something that Japanese find quite hard to relate to. They simply don't have them. And populism is not very prevalent there for several reasons. First of all, incomes are relatively evenly distributed relative to the West, so you don't have such extremes of wealth and poverty which cause resentment. Also, because there are few immigrants, there's less of a tendency to look for some minority group to blame for any problems that come along. And finally, and not least because of the complexities of the Japanese language, Japanese are somewhat sheltered from the extremes of controversy and hatred which circulate on the global English language social media. And interestingly, all of this perhaps explains why young Japanese people today are much less keen to go overseas, whether it's to study or to work, than they used to be when I was first posted in Japan in the 1980s and 90s. And for most of the world, it's probably gone in the other direction. But for young Japanese, their own country seems so safe and so comfortable that the rest of the world just seems a bit scary and unattractive. And this social cohesion that I was describing was also an advantage in the response to COVID. Japan was 6 times more successful at keeping its people alive than we were. Japan lost around 600 people per million through COVID, compared to about 3,500 people per million in the UK and in America. And Japan, to achieve that, didn't need to introduce any new draconian laws. The government just made gentle suggestions, and the compliant people tended to follow them. Part of the reason was also that Japanese people, and particularly their elderly people, started off much more healthy than their Western counterparts. Not least because of their dietary habits, means they don't have the plague of obesity that we see in the West. I think the statistics were that going into COVID, 40% of Americans were obese, 30% of British people were obese, and only 4% of Japanese were. But interestingly, though, the conformity in Japanese society can also mean that sometimes things move more slowly over there. And that was the case in the development and the introduction of COVID vaccines, which initially Japan lagged well behind Europe and America in, although eventually they did catch up. But Japan does have some challenges that would be rather unfamiliar to us here in the UK, in terms of the natural disasters that result from its geography. It's prone to extremes of weather, typhoons, snow blizzards, massive floods, and it's regularly hit by earthquakes and volcanoes and tsunami. And no doubt you can remember seeing on the news the huge tsunami in 2011, which hit the east coast of Japan. It killed around 20,000 people. It totally destroyed 120,000 homes, and it damaged over 1 million homes. And this is in a rich, advanced country. And most worryingly, during that incident, the nuclear power station at Fukushima, which became a household name around the world, went into meltdown. Eventually, it was brought under control, But for several days, there was a lot of fear because people didn't know how it was going to develop. So when I arrived there as ambassador in 2017, 6 years after that disaster, I made a point of making my first official visit outside of Tokyo to Fukushima, to pay my respects for the people who died and suffered there. And I actually visited and went inside that power station. And then following that accident, to compound matters, Japan had around 50 nuclear power stations, and they were all shut down. And up to that point, nuclear had been providing about 30% of Japan's total electricity. So you can imagine what impact that had, closing all those power stations down. And it's proved quite a slow process to get them opened again, because you have to do it site by site, getting permission and consent of the local people. The other set of challenges that I wanted to talk about are the many security challenges that arise in Japan's neighborhood. If you look at this map, you could say Japan has the neighbors from hell. Although, of course, it's fair to say that many of them also have some difficult memories of Japan from the 1930s and 40s. Perhaps most worrying is the DPRK, North Korea, and I know you had my colleague and very good friend, Alistair Morgan, on your speaker program, I think earlier this year, so he talked a lot about North Korea. But the Japanese have been very worried to see these regular testing of nuclear explosions and regularly sending test rockets which go across Japan's maritime boundaries, occasionally even go across the Japanese landmass. Most recently, on the 31st of October, the North Koreans sent an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, over the Japan Sea. And there's also a lesser-known issue which Japan has with North Korea, which is known as the hostage issue, because a number of Japanese citizens were abducted by North Korean agents back in the 1970s and 80s. Apparently, they were taken so they would help with the training of spies for North Korea. Officially, there are known to be at least 17 of them, but there were probably many more. A handful have been returned to Japan, but no one really knows about the rest, so it remains quite a big bilateral issue between the two countries. Next neighbor, Russia. And there's a long history between the two countries. Japan actually fought, and indeed won, the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, actually with British support. And there remains some unfinished business from World War II, because at the end of the war, Russia occupied 4 islands north of Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island, known as the Northern Territories. And Japan continues to claim those islands, and there's been no resolution in all of the years since the war. Prime Minister Abe met President Putin many times, and he tried to find some kind of deal which would basically involve swapping the return of the islands for massive economic investment by Japan into the Russian East. But they made no progress. And that search for a deal made it much harder for Prime Minister Abe's Japan to speak out against Russia. For example, after that nerve agent poisoning in Salisbury, which you'll all remember. Another neighbor, China. Again, there are historical sensitivities. Japan actually invaded Manchuria in 1931 and then widened that into the rest of China in 1937. And it was a very bloody and difficult period. And today they have direct territorial disputes. The Chinese claim some uninhabited islands called the Senkaku Islands, which are near Taiwan, this red dot on the map. And Japan holds them, but the Chinese claim them, and so you see regular incursions of Chinese ships and Chinese planes, and recently those incursions have been intensifying. And when you get those sorts of situations, there's always a danger that an accident can suddenly turn into an incident. And I'm going to be talking about China in a bit more detail in a moment. Next neighbor I want to talk about was the Republic of Korea. This has traditionally been quite a difficult and sensitive relationship. Japan occupied Korea between 1910 and 1945, and there are still festering concerns from that period about issues like the comfort women. These were women who were coerced into sexual exploitation, and also about forced labor who were shipped to Japan to work in their factories. And so right up to the present day, we see legal challenges and demands for compensation. Things did improve when the current Korean president, President Yoon, replaced President Moon in 2022. And one example of that relationship improving was that an agreement called GSOMIA, which stands for the General Security of Military Information Agreement, which had been first agreed in 2016, finally actually came into effect in 2023. And this allowed closer military-to-military cooperation. And it had been brokered by the United States, which is a big ally of both countries. Of course, it's not clear what's going to happen in Korea now, after President Yoon's abortive attempt to declare martial law earlier this week. And the opposition Democratic Party, who strengthened their grip over the National Assembly in an election earlier this year, are now apparently seeking to impeach him. And that Democratic Party are much less supportive of the US, Japan, Republic of Korea alliance. They're rather warmer towards China. So let me talk a bit more about the challenge of China as perceived by the Japanese. I've already mentioned the specific territorial issue of the Senkaku Islands, but Japan is also concerned about Chinese assertiveness throughout the East and South China Seas. And this map shows the so-called 9-dot line of Chinese territorial claims. More generally, Japan is also concerned about China undermining in various ways the US-led post-war international framework under which Japan has prospered mightily over the last 80 years. China's Belt and Road Initiative, which you've probably heard about, has hit Japan's traditional infrastructure business, supporting countries in places like Southeast Asia. And also China's approach to the way it funds some of those infrastructure projects through debt financing has tended to increase the political influence which they have over those recipient countries. Japan is also concerned about China's efforts to dominate key technologies, including sometimes by coercion or by industrial espionage, and also China's attempts to control the supply of critical minerals. Now, for many countries in the West, human rights and democracy are big issues in our relations with China, particularly the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, and particularly for Brits, the erosion of democratic rights, which we've seen in Hong Kong in recent years. Japan shares these concerns, but frankly, the Japanese government doesn't come under as much domestic political pressure on these issues because there are relatively few active NGOs which campaign on these kind of issues in Japan. But having talked about all those security challenges, there are also huge economic ties between the two countries. China is Japan's largest trading partner, and Japan is China's second largest trading partner after the USA. Their two-way trade was $270 billion in 2023. Japan is also a major investor in China. It has a stock of about $130 billion of investment in China, although that's beginning to decline, both for economic and for security reasons. And Japan is also conscious that we all need China to be part of the solution to some of the big global challenges that we face, like the struggle against climate change and about the response to global pandemics. Now, the most important flashpoint for China's intentions in the Indo-Pacific is obviously Taiwan. I'm not a Taiwan expert, but I did visit there in February this year, not long after their election, which was won by President Lai, who's at the more nationalistic end of the spectrum. And Japan has had a very long relationship with Taiwan. Taiwan was actually part of the Japanese Empire from 1895 all the way through to 1945. And it was a relatively long, fairly stable period in which the Taiwanese economy flourished. And as a result, current relations are pretty good. Taiwan is also physically quite close to parts of Japan. It's only 400 miles away from the Japanese islands of Okinawa. So Okinawa is much closer to Taiwan than it is to the Japanese mainland. There are many business ties. In fact, Japan is heavily dependent on Taiwanese semiconductors, although they're trying to reduce that dependence by making massive investments in building their own new wafer fabs in Japan. Japan is also concerned about the rights to freedom of navigation in the seas around Taiwan, because these sea lanes are vital to the Japanese economy as a big trading country. So Japan largely takes its steer on Taiwan from the United States. The big question that everyone asks is, if China were to attack Taiwan, what would be the response of the United States? And maybe in discussion time we can turn to what would be the response of the US when it's under Donald Trump. American policy has been one of what they call strategic ambiguity, to keep China guessing, although it became increasingly less ambiguous under President Biden. But if anything were to happen, it's difficult to see Japan not getting dragged into the conflict, because America's massive military assets on the island of Okinawa would be central to any campaign, and that would make Okinawa a target too. And Japan would also be heavily impacted by financial and trade sanctions, which no doubt the West would introduce. So there's lots of speculation now about whether Trump is less likely to rush to defend Taiwan. But in practice, we're probably unlikely to see the scenario of a big military invasion. If anything did happen, it would be much more likely to be a slower economic strangulation, attempts to run trade blockades and things. But let's hope it doesn't come to that, and it's certainly not inevitable that it will. So let me talk a bit about Japan's traditional approach to defense policy. Japanese ordinary citizens suffered greatly during the wars of the 1930s and the 1940s, and it's very conscious that it is the only country ever to have been hit by a nuclear bomb, two, in fact. Of course, at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this means that Japanese people today hold very pacifist views, and they're extremely suspicious of any signs of government-led nationalism or militarism. The ruling LDP, who are the Liberal Democrats, their name is Liberal Democrat, but they're actually, in our terms, a right-of-centre conservative party. And they've traditionally been in an alliance, an electoral alliance, with a minority party, the Komeito, who are a Buddhist-linked party, and as a Buddhist-linked party, they have a pacifist inclination, and so they've often acted as a brake on the LDP in the defense sphere. And so one consequence of this background is that Japan has what is known as a pacifist constitution, which was something that was drafted under the US occupation. And the US occupation lasted from the end of the Second World War through till 1952, and actually in Okinawa it lasted all the way up to 1972. And so this constitution limits their ability to maintain a military. They're not allowed to call it a military, they have to call it a self-defense force, and it largely prohibits them from operating outside of Japan. They also have a self-denying ordinance, which they've had for many decades, not to spend more than 1% of their GDP on defense, although admittedly that's 1% of a very large GDP. My Japanese friends used to joke, you in NATO have to pretend to be spending more on defense than you really do, and we have to pretend to be spending less. But despite these limitations, Japan has actually built up a pretty large standing military. They have 230,000 serving men and women, and a defense budget of about $45 billion, which makes them 10th in the world. But the Japanese military remain largely untested in actual conflict. They've had a few tentative involvements in United Nations peacekeeping operations, but they've generally steered well away from any trouble which could lead to casualties. Now, the long-standing Prime Minister and nationalist Shinzo Abe, who I put a picture up of earlier, he tried to amend that pacifist constitution to allow Japan to have a more normal defense stance, but he failed to get the legislation he wanted, though he was able to gradually reinterpret the constitution to allow slightly more operational flexibility. And Japan remains resolutely opposed to nuclear weapons for very obvious reasons, although some would say that that's a bit hypocritical whilst they shelter under the US nuclear umbrella. So all of this pacifism means that there has been a huge reliance on the United States. The US and Japan have been in a security alliance since 1951. I'm not sure whether you can see all of that detail, but I don't think you really need to. You just need to get the impression that there is an enormous amount of American military presence spread around Japan. They have over 50,000 military personnel permanently based in Japan. The US 7th Fleet, led by a carrier group, is based at Yokosuka, which is just outside Tokyo. There are also major air bases, there are marine contingents, and 2/3 of all of these are based in Okinawa. And although generally Japanese citizens welcome this American presence, the people who live on Okinawa itself, for them, the scale and the proximity of these American forces and the problems that a concentration of young military personnel can cause has sometimes led to local frictions. Now, the Russian invasion of Ukraine had a significant impact on Japanese thinking about security. Not so much to do with the Ukraine itself, because for Japanese, as for many Asians, the Ukraine is a faraway place about which they don't know very much. But mainly because, for most people in Asia, they tend to look at the Ukraine crisis through the prism of Taiwan, and they think about what it means for how to deter a potential aggressor. And I think Japan drew two main conclusions from what they saw in Ukraine. First of all, you need to be able to defend yourself, at least initially. And secondly, you need to be part of strong alliances, and you need to be seen to contributing to those alliances if you want them to come and help you. And so Japan's response was, first of all, to become much more outspoken about Russia. And that's partly because the then Prime Minister, Kishida, didn't have the same baggage that Abe had because of Abe trying to negotiate the settlement of the disputed islands with Putin. Japan introduced some really strong sanctions, although they were a bit more cautious in the energy space. So they considered, but then decided not to go ahead with divesting their significant oil and gas interests in the Russian peninsula of Sakhalin. And I think the main reason they didn't was because they concluded if they withdrew, the Chinese would simply come in and snap up the assets. And then in December 2022, Japan published 3 key documents which set out a step change in their security posture. They were a national security strategy, a national defense strategy, and a defense build-up program. And the most significant element of it was a massive increase in the defense budget from 1% to 2% of GDP by 2027. In practice, this doubling effectively increased the actual hard military spending by about 60%, and the rest is going more on ancillary areas like the civilian Coast Guard and so on. But this would have the effect of moving Japan from the 10th largest military spender in the world to the 3rd largest. So it really is a significant development. Also, in a new departure, they included for the first time something called first strike capability, and that basically means the ability to attack an adversary on their own distant territory, not just waiting to prevent incoming traffic when they attack you. And earlier this year, to implement it, they announced a big purchase of US Tomahawk missiles, although eventually they'll be making their own missiles. So why did this Prime Minister Kishida, who was known as being rather dovish, for 2 reasons. First of all, he's a dove by his personal temperament, but also his constituency is in Hiroshima, and you could hardly be a militarist if your constituency was Hiroshima. So how is it that he was able to make more progress on defense in shifting the dial than the much more hawkish Abe? Well, one reason, obviously, was perceptions of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I just talked about. But I think it was also because the Japanese people perhaps felt that they could trust the instincts of the pacifist Kishida a little bit more. And of course, if you're doubling your defense spending, there are huge challenges in how you're going to pay for it. Higher taxes, increased debt, cutting spending in other areas. It's all open to debate, and they're on track so far, but it remains a significant issue. So let me just give you a quick snapshot on current Japanese politics. Kishida, who's seen here, passed the leadership to current Prime Minister Ishiba in October this year, after his own popularity had plummeted in the light of a series of party funding scandals. Ishiba immediately called a snap election, thinking that he'd have a honeymoon period and there'd be a bit of a bounce, but he failed. Rather like Theresa May in 2017, he lost his majority. So he's now having to govern as a minority government. That means he has to obtain agreement to get his budget passed, and each new piece of legislation on a case-by-case basis, negotiating with the opposition parties, who of course will demand their price for that. And that makes Prime Minister Ishiba's position relatively weak, slightly unstable, and it strengthens the role of Japan's excellent bureaucrats. And there's another election due next summer for the upper house, and if Ishiba can't regain public support by then his position is obviously going to look pretty vulnerable. So China's response to the perceived challenge of China is partly about beefing up its own capabilities in the way that I've just described, but it's also about internationalizing the issue as far as possible. I've already mentioned the massive reliance on the United States, and Japan has worried for some time about rising isolationist trends in America and a growing reluctance among Americans to bear the costs of being the world's policeman. The US has moved a long way since President Obama announced that the US would be making an Asian pivot. He did that in 2011 on a visit to Australia, and I was actually in the audience for that speech, which he gave in the Australian Parliament. Now, you might ask, what is the difference between the American Asian pivot and the UK's Indo-Pacific tilt, which you've probably heard about? Pivot, tilt. I think you'd have to be a judge on Strictly to explain the difference. During the previous Trump administration, Prime Minister Abe was very successful at handling Trump, ensuring that the US remained committed to the Asia-Pacific region and avoiding the most damaging trade restrictions which might have hit Japan. Some people even described Abe as a Trump whisperer for his ability to coax and cajole Trump. It's likely to be a bit different this time around, because everything Trump has said suggests that he will seek to reduce foreign entanglements, avoid being dragged into conflicts. And on the other hand, Trump does like to project strength, and so I think he won't want to be seen as kowtowing to China. So how his policies emerge are going to be watched very closely in Japan. But I think what most people would say is that Ishiba, by his character and the fact that he has a relatively weak political position at home, is unlikely to be a new Trump whisperer. And on the economics front, Trump, as you've seen in the news, has already announced plans for big new tariffs on Canada, on Mexico, on China, and all of that's very worrying for Japan. As I said before, the US is its second largest trading partner. 10% of Japan's trade is with the US. And beyond the US, Japan has also sought new partners and alliances. Japan isn't permanently at the top table in the UN Security Council, even though it's a massive funder of the United Nations. And at the moment, it is currently a rotating member of the United Nations for a 2-year period, which ends at the end of this year. So in fact, G7 is the favored international body for Japan, and Japan hosted the G7 last year in Hiroshima. They made a big focus on the economic security agenda, and they also featured the Ukraine. They invited President Zelensky to attend that meeting. If you haven't seen this image before, the building at the back with the roof missing is one of the few buildings in Hiroshima which remains standing after the nuclear bomb, and is a big symbol of that terrible incident. Japan is also an active member of something called the Asia-Pacific Quad, which it participates in together with the US, Australia, and India. And that group are supporting the countries of the region, for example, those in Southeast Asia, with their maritime security. They're also trying to help them with their infrastructure so that they're less reliant on China. And they're also looking for ways to work together on economic security, because there have been increasingly rising concerns about becoming over-reliant on potentially hostile countries for key resources and for key technologies. And so you increasingly hear phrases like friend-shoring. People used to talk about reshoring, where you bring your investments home. Friend-shoring is about where you move key economic activities to countries which are your allies or at least are broadly sympathetic to you. The Japanese are also doing more bilaterally with Australia, and there have even been calls for Japan to join aspects of AUKUS. You may have heard about AUKUS, which is the Australia-UK-US alliance, which was set up about 3 years ago. And it's mainly based around helping Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. And so Japan wouldn't be involved in that. But there's a second pillar to it, which is about other advanced technologies which are important for security. And so maybe we'll see AUKUS becoming JAUKUS in due course. Japan is also getting closer to India, which, of course, has its own rivalries with China. Japan was historically a supporter of the Indian independence movement, and now they're cooperating in areas like building a bullet train for India. Japan is also building up links with other partners outside of its region, and most particularly with the United Kingdom. So let me give you very briefly some background on UK-Japanese relations. And in modern times, these have always been pretty positive, but they've tended to be largely focused on economic cooperation more than political and security. Back in the 1980s, when a lot of European countries were trying to keep out the Japanese companies, Margaret Thatcher welcomed Japanese investment into the UK, and they made major investments in sectors like automotives and electronics, transformed the UK supply chain in those sectors, and they became big players in various regional economies, like the Northeast, for example. And that flow of investment was so successful that even today, still some 40% of all Japanese investment in Europe rests in the UK. Recently, we've been seeing a big expansion of Japanese investment in the UK's renewable energy sector, particularly in wind power. So all this investment meant that when Brexit came along, it was potentially quite worrying for Japan. And of course, they recognized that it was the UK's right to make whatever democratic choices it wanted, but they wanted to ensure that they could still trade freely across their big European supply chains, lots of the components coming into those car factories, and that they would be able to serve their big European markets, because about 80% of the cars coming out of those factories were being exported. And it was so important to them that they were actually rather more vocal than is usually the case with the Japanese. They tend to like to keep a relatively low profile. And I think you had a former Japanese ambassador in London, Koji Tsuruoka, came and talked at one of your previous events, and you will recall that he was rather an outspoken person, much more outspoken than Japanese normally are, and so he was very active during that Brexit campaign, not always conveniently so for the British government. And I was in the middle of this as the British ambassador in Tokyo at the time. I was helping to try to explain to the Japanese what the different developments in the UK meant, and also to try to ensure that their voices could be heard in London. But it was pretty challenging at a time when the UK's government's own position wasn't always very clear. In the event, I think Japanese investors ended up being broadly content with the outcomes, and we avoided seeing any major exodus of Japanese investors. Some of them, in sectors like finance and pharmaceuticals, had to move some of their functions inside the euro area for regulatory reasons, but we think that this was mostly less than about 5% of their total UK operations. Unfortunately, for a variety of other reasons, the UK remains a highly attractive base for them, but we can't afford to be complacent about that. When I was ambassador in Tokyo, we also saw a big increase in the political and security cooperation, and most notably in naval cooperation. This culminated in a visit by the Queen Elizabeth Carrier Strike Group in 2021, which enabled some highly visible exercises between the UK, the US, and the Japanese navies all working together. And that made a very strong statement in that part of the world. Then in 2022, Japan and the UK, plus Italy, announced an agreement to cooperate on designing and building a major new fighter jet program, which is called GCAP, the Global Combat Air Program. And this was a big step forward for Japan because it was their first ever major defense program which was not involving the United States. And it's going to involve them in a very close security relationship with the UK, which is going to stretch over a number of decades in the future. More generally, post-Brexit, I can't remember either. I think it used to be something in politics. More generally, post-Brexit, Japan and the UK have been strengthening their relationship. And on the economic front, a bilateral trade deal, the CEPA, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which I helped to negotiate, was concluded in 2020, and it was our first major post-EU trade deal. And this year, with significant Japanese support, the UK joined the big plurilateral trade agreement, CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, trips off the tongue. And that agreement, the CPTPP, is incidentally something that the Japanese had showed real leadership in bringing about because the US had walked away from those negotiations back in 2017. And I think this relationship seems set to continue to strengthen under the current Labour government, and this is Keir Starmer with Ishiba, the current Japanese Prime Minister. And Japan has also been strengthening security ties with other democracies, like France and Canada, for example. So to conclude, Japan sees itself facing evolving, deepening threats within its own region. It's increasingly taking additional responsibility for its own defenses, which is quite a departure for a country which has been fundamentally pacifist for many decades. It's still an active debate about all of this within Japan. And Japan is also forming and deepening new partnerships with others inside and outside of its region, including very significantly with the United Kingdom. But at the end of the day, its relationship with the United States is going to remain its most fundamental alliance. Finally, I just wanted to tell you something about my book on Japan. As I was preparing to leave the country after 4 years as ambassador there, I decided that I would do 39 tweets about my favorite things about Japan, its natural environment, its history and culture, everyday life. Why 39, you might be asking? Well, because the numbers 3 and 9 in Japanese can be pronounced san-kyu, and so it was my way of saying thank you to Japan. And these tweets proved surprisingly popular. No one was more surprised than me, but they developed quite a big Japanese following. And so when I returned to the UK, I decided to turn them into a book with a chapter on each of the 39 things, including the interesting and sometimes pretty amusing feedback that came from some of the Japanese Twitter followers. Now, I didn't come here today primarily to sell you my book. I don't make my living from books. But if my lecture has whetted your appetite to know a bit more about Japan, then there are a few copies outside, and I'm very happy to sign them. Thank you all very much for attending tonight, and I hope you've found some interest. I look forward to the Q&A session.